afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So we have now a presentation from our colleague Paula Fikkert. We've been working together since the 90s. She has been inspiring the work on language and the phonological acquisition, sorry, Ana Lucia, here at the department. I was going to say language acquisition.
Oh, you could say that.
So, and this is, of course, the topic of this presentation is always a research question open to us all. Some of the people in the room have followed your work in the 90s, and other groups have been following also the other type of work you've been doing that you will be talking about. Thank you very much for being here with us, Paula.
Yes, I've been here several times before, so some of you may have heard parts of the talk before, but I'm going to take you through my travel to where I'm starting now. I'm at the start of a new project, and I'll end with that new project. No results yet because we just started, but I can tell you what our ambition is with this project. But so let's start. I was trained as a linguist, and I started out with production work. And I did a huge data collection together with my long-term collaborator, Clara Leveld, who I am now collaborating in this new project also with. So I'm really happy that we started together, and then at the end of our careers, now hopefully not yet, but work together again. So we did a lot of production work, and we looked at longitudinal data. We tried to, so in my thesis, I looked at the acquisition of prosodic structure of words, so mostly syllable structure and stress. And for instance, one of the things that I found is that children, for a word like ballon, they all say something like lon, bom, bomme. And this is not only in Dutch, this is all across the globe. Children leave out the first unstressed syllable, but I was tracking the development of them, and I came up with a nice story. I think it was a nice story because even though it's sometimes misquoted, what I showed is that children start with monosyllabic words. And so for that you don't need any parameters for stress, because stress is entirely predictable. It is on that one syllable. But the next step is if you then produce two syllables, you have to make a choice, left or right. You add a syllable. And so then you have to make a choice. And for Dutch children, that will be the trochee, because Dutch is predominantly trochaic. And so you have your first parameter set. Your language is trochaic. And then next, when you discover words that are disyllabic but have initial stress, and disyllabic words that have final stress, you need to decide what to do. And so that might be a cue to learn about the quantity sensitivity of syllables. So here your next parameter comes in. So I didn't assume the parameters to be there, but the way children improved during time led to a nice parameter system for stress. Well, now, parameters in phonology are completely out, but it doesn't really matter. It is the descriptive way of how to get to a formal linguistic system without presupposing the system underlyingly. So it is built up, but it is really abstract. So I was really proud. I was going to conferences talking about it, and then so the questions that we ask is what is the child's representation of the word? If the child says bom or bomme, what is the representation of the child's form in his or her mental lexicon? And that's really a difficult question to answer, because it could be that the adult form is there from the start, and there is something going on in the mapping process when you build prosodic structure onto it, or it could be just reflecting the child's representation that is expanded, or it could be something more complex. Well, it's really hard to, because the data are compatible with almost all of these representations. So you have to look at the developmental patterns to get some insight into that. And one of the questions is also, is prosodic structure stored, or is it created on top of segmental representations that we have? I think phonologists think that it is not stored, because you can have simple rules that for most of the data. But psycholinguists assume that there is a metrical template. And that's also because you have sometimes this idea you can't remember the name of someone, but you know it's 3 syllables, stress on the second. So those kind of abstract information we do have in our, it does occur, but how to account for it is not an easy pattern. So this was what I did for my thesis, and then I also looked at segmental structure, and one of the things that struck me is if you look at those 2 simple words, kip, chicken, or book, in the whole database, none of the children used the word, produced the word kip correctly. So they did all kinds of things. So they said tip or pip, sometimes even pick, so the right sounds, but changed in order. And this also raises the question, what is the child's representation? Why do they do this? What is their underlying form, and how does it develop? We found all these nice patterns, and then I went to conferences and talked about it, and as long as I was talking to linguists, I got fairly positive reviews. As soon as I started to talk to developmental psychologists, they said, yeah, but this is production. You need to look at perception, because we know that in perception they can already do all these things. So I was talking to Peter Jusik at the time, who was then about to publish this study, which was 15 experiments. It's an impressive paper because they use 15 experiments to find out whether children can, when and how children can segment words that start with stress or have an iambic pattern. It turns out they can't do it with 6 months in his study. They can do it with 7.5 months for trochees and 10.5 months for iams. So he said, it's nice your story about production, but they can already do it at 10.5 months. In the segmental literature, you had a bit of the same. Peter Jusik there too, he did all these word segmentation studies with the head-turn preference procedure, and showed that children can easily, certainly at 7.5 months, they can find words in the speech stream. And if you habituate them, if you teach them to listen to certain words, and they then reappear in a speech stream, they find those words. They don't find the words if we slightly mispronounce those words. Therefore, he argued, children already have a very detailed representation and sufficiently rich representation, because if it was not the case, if it was more global, they would accept those as words, because there were minor mispronunciations. And then my former lab colleague, Dan Swingley and Eslin, they did a very different procedure. They did looking while listening with eye tracking, also did mispronunciations. And what they showed is that if words are mispronounced, children don't look as long as when it is correctly pronounced, arguing for detailed representations of phonological forms. And then the whole bunch of studies on perceptual tuning showed that children already in the first year of life tune into the sound system of their native language. So there's nothing wrong with their perception, and they have clear representations. That's the argument. So Jusik said to me, are you sure what do these production data actually tell us? And so that was the start for me to also go into perception research, because I thought, well, discrimination, so all the studies on discrimination and the perceptual tuning, those are all discrimination studies, and the child has to indicate whether something is the same or different. And discrimination is a really easy task. Lots of animals can do it very well, and it's just discrimination, and it doesn't necessarily tell you so much about their phonological system. So I thought, well, it doesn't convince me that much that they can do it. It's good that they tune into their native system, because that's what they need to do, but whether that means that they have a phonological system, I'm not so sure of. And also being able to segment the words, to do a segmentation study correctly, if you segment a word, doesn't really mean that you have a correct representation of the word. We don't actually know on what basis they do. We know that they use stress cues, we know that they use all kinds of cues, but we don't have evidence that they have a correct representation of the word. And if they can't do it, they often say the tasks are too difficult, difficult, and it's the cognitive demand that makes them not focus on the phonetic detail, and therefore, they can't do it. But none of the theories really looked seriously into phonological theory. And if you look at the wide set of tasks that they have been used, hardly any study uses a bidirectional testing. So most studies have tests from P to T, or from B to D, or from P to B, but not vice versa. To know whether that makes a difference, you really crucially have to do it both ways, because that may make a difference. And I think there's no disagreement that phonological representations mediate between perception and production. So we don't have a representation for, it's not the same process. I mean, with articulation, you use your articulators to produce. With perception, you use the acoustic signal to get into your lexicon. But the phonological representations are mediating between the two. So they might be more abstract than either articulatory or phonetics. If representations are adult-like, we have to account for why children deviate in production and why that is so systematic. But we also need to understand better what happens in the production and the perception processes. And recent studies recent perception studies, for a long time it was only group results that were reported, but people are now seeing that there's actually lots of individual differences also in the perception studies. Our perception studies are not good enough to tap into the individual difference. So far we only find correlations, and we can't say much about each individual in a test, but that's what the research is gearing towards. And we don't really understand the individual differences yet. We know that there are correlations sometimes not, with later studies, but we don't really understand which direction, what causes what. And if children make errors in production, one thing that we also want to know and better understand is, when do children know that they don't produce it correctly and change? So when are they able to monitor their own speech or the speech of others to correct their previous form? Because error-based learning requires monitoring of the speech, either of your own speech, if you make the mistake, or of other people, and then you must be able to compare your own form with that of others. So that is a skill that we as adults are very good in. We have monitoring skills all the time, but we don't know about children when they are able to do that. So that's why we started this Perplex. One of my PhD student, Fleur Visser, has made this nice picture. And here we are going to look into perception and production of the same children. And we are trying to tap into the different processes in perception and production. I'll get back to it a little bit later with a bit more detail. So this is the short step. So let's connecting perception and production. So when I started this production research and we looked at the database, there are certain patterns that reappear. So one of the patterns is asymmetries in production. For instance, I was telling you that the word book is almost always produced correctly. A word like kip is not. So that's difficult. So what you find is, if a word starts with a labial, the labial is always produced. If it starts with a coronal, it may sometimes be produced correctly, sometimes more variable. If it starts with a dorsal, those come typically late in Dutch and in many other languages, although it's not. English is a bit different. I don't know about Portuguese, where the dorsals are early, but in Dutch they're typically quite late. And if they are produced early, often there's something different with the child. But So the labials are produced correctly. The dorsals and the coronals, the tus and the kus, are more variable. In manner, particularly stop fricative, you find a bit of the same. Here, a fricative is often produced as a plosive, but not the reverse. Boek never becomes voek. That always stays a stop. That's also something that has been noted for many languages. So here you see a similar asymmetry, and that is, if you find an asymmetry, you find it this direction. You don't always find an asymmetry, but most of the children show an asymmetry. And with voicing is also interesting, it's tested a lot, because it's one of the things that you can measure so nicely. What you find is in Dutch, you find that voiced stops are often produced as voiceless, and voiceless stops are never produced, almost never produced with a voicing. Now Dutch, I think like Portuguese, is a pre-voicing language, so we have the vocal cords vibrate before the plosive. It's different from German and English, where it is more aspiration that is the marking. So there you find the reverse. But here, for Dutch, you find target stops are often produced as voices, but not the reverse. So also a clear asymmetry. Yeah, and that's for aspiration. So aspiration languages, they have the children learning, for instance, English or German, acquire that much earlier and show the reverse pattern, so which is interesting. So whether the asymmetry occurs, that depends on the phonological feature that is at stake, so the contrast. It also depends on the position of the word. In certain positions you find it more than others. And it crucially depends on the development of the phonological system of the child. Now that is something that we can sort of look in when we look at longitudinal production data, because you can see what the development is. But in perception data, that's really hard so far, because usually what happens if we do an experiment, we call parents to come to the lab, we test the children, they go home, and we have the results of 40 babies and say the group results is this. But we have no clue about their phonological system, because that we typically don't. So at best we do a CDI, but that gives you something about the lexicon, but not about the phonological system. So what do the asymmetries in production tell us? If they are so systematic, then we should also find them in perception, right? If those are part of your representation, if your phonological representation somehow expresses this asymmetry, then you would also expect them in perception studies, if they tell us something about their phonological representation. If production is something different from perception, you may not find that. Then it's really something for production. But if you find it also in perception, that's a link that the two are related. So that's why I wanted to go into the perception field. Luckily, Ann Cutler got a big prize and established the first baby lab in the Netherlands, and so we have a well-equipped lab. It's now even bigger because we are now grown so much, but that the city has to grow to have enough babies to test in the city, because Nijmegen it's not Lisbon, we have a fairly small town. So the very first the perception study that I did was with Suzanne van der Feest, and we did it. We followed Dan Swingley's paradigm. Dan was still in the lab, and he was advisor on the project. And it was a very simple word recognition where we did the mispronunciation. So we had correct pronunciations, we had mispronunciations of place and mispronunciations of voice. So poes was produced as poes, correctly pronounced, or as toes, mispronounced. And vice versa, tand was produced as tand or pand, mispronounced. So both directions. And if you put all the words together, you look at correct versus mispronounced, you find what everyone else finds, namely they look less in the mispronounced conditions. However, that wasn't our question. We wanted to see whether it makes a difference one direction or the other. And indeed it does. It makes a big difference. For instance, if you have a labial that is produced correctly, you see that it is very high, it goes really well. If a labial is mispronounced, it hinders word recognition. So if you say toes for poes, the children say, huh, what? I don't recognize that word. Even if the other item is a well-known word, that could also not be. Mispronunciations of labials hinder recognition. But mispronunciations of coronals, you see exactly the same behavior. So a word is recognized, and there's no difference whether it is correctly pronounced or mispronounced. That's striking, right? So this was the very first that we did. Then we did it with 20-month-olds. We did it with 18-month-olds. We did it with known words. We taught them new words and tested the asymmetry. We did stops and fricatives. We did nasals. We did habituation paradigm, a completely different technique. And whatever we did, we kept on finding this same asymmetry. So it's a very strong result. We found it with different methods, generalized over different segments. So it really seems to have to do with the phonological feature. So there's a clear asymmetry not only in production, but also in perception. So from labial to coronal, easy. The difference is always noticed, and therefore it hinders recognition, and mispronounced doesn't lead to recognition. But the coronal mispronounced, who cares? And that's not so strange, because if you look at the behavior of coronals in many languages, including Dutch, they assimilate all over the place. So if you have a word like inpakken, it becomes inpakken. So then it's always the coronals that assimilate, also in adult language. If you look at manner, so we have, this is a habituation paradigm where you bore the child by saying paaf, 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 until the looking time goes down, and then you give a new item that is either the same or different. You expect them to dishabituate if it's different, and they can hear the difference. So it looks like, in the beginning they find it interesting, but then their attention drops because it's boring. It's also why the dropout rate in this type of experiment is higher. But if there's a switch, they are supposed to look up, and if it's the same, they don't care. So here is the stop fricative contrast. If you take all data together, you see a clear effect, which is what you maybe expect. But if you take the two directions separately, then you see if a child is habituated on a stop, and then here's a fricative, no difference in looking time. No dishabituation. If a fricative is replaced by a stop, the child says, huh, what's happening? So that is really noticeable. From fricative to stop, they notice. From stop to fricative, they don't. This was the habituation. We also did this in the mispronunciation paradigm with known words like tree, boom, or ball. And again, you find this exactly the same pattern. So a fricative that is mispronounced hinders word recognition. A stop that is mispronounced doesn't matter. This is a bit more surprising because there's no stop fricative rules in Dutch. But still, this is a very significant pattern, and a pattern that we also recognize from the production data. So here, also clear asymmetries. A fricative that is mispronounced leads to, that difference is clearly noticed and hinders recognition, a stop that is mispronounced is fine. This go unnoticed. Well, all languages have stops. Not all languages have fricatives, but stops are acquired very early. Fricatives are typically quite late in acquisition. Then voicing. This is the mispronunciation paradigm for voicing. And what you see is a similar pattern on the face of it. So you see if a voiceless stop is mispronounced, that really hinders word recognition. If a voice stop is mispronounced, that doesn't matter. For the 20-month-olds, there's no significant difference. They also don't produce the contrast yet, and they seem to show random behavior in perception. So here too, we find clear asymmetries. From voiceless to voiced is noticed and hinders recognition. From voiced to voiceless, they don't care. Well, not all languages have a voicing contrast, and if languages have a voicing contrast, that can be going different ways. So I already told you German and English have an aspiration versus unvoiced, unaspirated stop. In Dutch we have pre-voicing and an aspirated stop. So here it seems to be really something more language specific. It is acquired also late, which is also evident in the perception studies. And so here you see also the same, you see the same, so we have seen the same asymmetries that I noticed for production in perception. And they seem to be driven by phonological features, not sounds, or it seems to be across different categories of sounds and across different methods. So how can we link perception and production? So labials are produced correctly most of the time. Coronals are often correct, but can also be variable. And mispronounced labials hinder recognition. So it seems that these labials are really well represented in the child's lexicon, because if they are mispronounced, that really hinders recognition. That's not the case for coronals, so the coronals are maybe not so clearly specified. So that's why we argue that labials are specified, coronals are underspecified. And if you're underspecified, you don't have coronal in your representation, that means that you are more flexible, because if you hear a labial, that is not a mismatch with your representation. So the fact that you are underspecified means that your boundary is more lenient and you allow more variation. So this is a way of representing it. If you assume that the labial P of the word poes has the feature labial, or the acoustic variant that, and the word tand doesn't have anything specified, that is your lexical representation, your phonological representation. That is not to say that they can't hear the difference, because to do this task, you listen to the input, to have a mismatch for poes, when you hear toes, means that you have to be able to hear the T, that you hear the coronal. And the coronal is also a very salient feature in the signal. So it's not the case that they can't hear the signal. The signal, they get the features out of the signal, or the corresponding acoustics. And what you then have to do, so this is also what you use for discrimination, and that's no surprise that they can do it, because they can hear the difference. But what you have to do to go to your lexicon is to, the features that you hear in the speech signal have to match to the features that are in your lexical representation. And if there's nothing in your lexical representation, like for the word tand, this empty symbol means nothing specified, then whatever you hear, it is not a mismatch. It will not be perfect, it will be not very helpful even, and you also see that you saw that the recognition was also much lower, also in the correct representation. So you saw if it is for the words that were having a feature represented, like the labial, the recognition rate was much higher. So if the feature is represented, it helps you. So the coronals are not so helpful because they don't have anything specified and they allow many more words to match. That's not the case with push. Push has a labial feature. If you hear a coronal feature, that mismatches with your lexicon. So no wonder that you say, well, tus is not push. That's out, it's a conflict. So it is using the concept from psycholinguistics that you have inhibition if it is conflicting with your representation. So with this assumption, all the predictions were nicely borne out for place of articulation. For manner, it also nicely works out, more or less. So, except that you here have a little bit of a difference, where I said for labial, labials are represented. For manner, I assume that stops are underspecified and fricatives are specified. The friction is also a clear, salient feature in the signal. And in the beginning, children only produce stops, so they don't have a contrast. That is different from place, where they have there is more contrast with place than for manner, or for the obstruents. And fricatives are not, particularly in initial position, are very often either produced as stops or left out. But we see in the perception that a mispronounced fricative leads to hinders recognition. So here's a little bit of a different switch, and it's also because the contrast comes in later than the place of articulation contrast. But if you do make a similar picture where you have the fricative marked and the stop unmarked, then that nicely predicts the data that you get in perception. Voicing is yet more difficult because in the beginning they don't produce any contrast and they don't seem to perceive the contrast in perception either. It just doesn't matter for them. And they start producing the contrast at around 2. And then they also show this clear asymmetry. But then it seems to be the case that once you hear voicing in the signal, it needs to dock onto something in your lexicon because the voicing feature is a marked feature, and so it needs to find a word with a voicing feature. And mispronunciation, the voiced one, if you find a voiced feature and you cannot find a correlate for it, that hinders recognition. So yet a slightly different procedure as from place and manner. So it's not as neat as I would have loved it. It would be a much easier talk to give, but that's what the data show. And so here, the picture doesn't really work out so well, because here, normally one would assume that the voiceless, unaspirated, unvoiced is default, because that's what you see if you compare to other languages, that's the default. And voice is then marked. But then you would expect that if you hear voiceless, that would be a mismatch. But it isn't. It is the other way around. And it's the other way around also for adults. Adults show the same thing. If we so Dutch speakers often leave out pre-voicing, and that doesn't really hinder speakers. So Dutch adults and children show the same pattern. So place and manner of articulation show a very clear pattern. Coronals are unmarked. That's also natural. That's how they behave in many languages. For stops, it's also stops typically show a default behavior. Voice also shows a clear pattern, but it's different. And maybe that's because voicing comes in later and is language specific and not part of universal. So when children do not systematically produce a contrast, they usually prefer the default. So they prefer stops and they prefer stops over fricatives. when they do make a systematic contrast, one of the values is underspecified, leading to these asymmetries in perception. And under the analysis that I've given, even if it's not completely neat, one thing that's very clear, if you compare the children's production data with these assumptions on their representations, what they do in production, if they make an error, they leave out a phonological feature. So they don't change anything, they just leave out a feature. And I think that's a very elegant analysis, because that's what children often do. The errors of omission are much more frequent than the errors of commission. They don't really make a mistake, they just produce not all the relevant features. So I think it's nice that we find this pattern. I still don't completely understand why we find these slightly different patterns for stops, for place, manner, and voicing. But the data sort of are in line. The asymmetries that you find in perception, you also find in production. And so this underspecification really explains a lot of the variation that you find. And it also shows that phonological representations then are getting slightly more complex in the course of development, which is also a nice feature of the model. They are abstract, but the perception, they need to use all those features in perception to be able to do it, to be able to do the matching system. And so I think studying systematic patterns in production provides us a really nice agenda for testing children's comprehension data, more than just discrimination. So I could have stopped here because it's nice and clear, but I'm still sort of not completely satisfied because I don't understand all of it yet. And so I still haven't dealt with the individual data because all the perception studies that I've told you were group results of all children. I've also not been able to take into account the phonological system a little bit, but they were not from the same children, so I took the general acquisition patterns that we find in the data and assumed that the other children that we tested for perception had those characteristics. But it would be so much nicer if we could have perception data and production data of the same children, because only then do you really know. And we have tried it, but it's a bit of a logistical nightmare because it is difficult. But with a team, and so but also what we would like to know in the description of in the production data, you can nicely show that representations of that children's outputs change in the course of development. For perception data, that has been really hard, because if you test a child on a study at, say, 12 months, and you do the same child again 2 months later, they don't like to do the experiment, so you don't get the same data. So with eye tracking, it's slightly easier, but with habituation, they just don't do it. You have a much larger dropout rate because they clearly remember after 2 months, well, this task was really boring. I'm not going to do this again. So it's more difficult to do the longitudinal perception data than the production data. And we also would like to know this question that I raised in the beginning: when do children know that they make a mistake, that they produce things differently from adults? And when do they notice that in the perception, and when do they notice that in the production? So we came up with a grant proposal that wants to study everything. So we want to study the same children's production and perception. We also want to know what their phonological system is when they enter the lab. And so that means that we have to come up with a very smart way of tapping into it. So have a quick scan at the children's homes before they come. So we do a lot of things, and also we check their articulation skills with the computer articulation instrument that is developed by Ben Maassen and colleagues. So we do a whole test battery, whole investigation of the child before they come to the lab. And then we're going to get them twice in a row for different experiments, and we have to make sure that the experiments are sufficiently different that they don't think, oh, I've done that before, I don't want to do this again. And we do both perception and production, so we probably get them in two sets, 2 production, 2 perception studies in one go. But they all have to be short and they have to be entertaining. So currently we're working on this. So one of the experiments, the prompted revisions, has been recently published by, a pilot has been published by Klaartje Leefeld, and that's is a really promising method where she asks the child, oh, what's that? And points to a picture of, say, a chicken. And maybe the child says Pip instead of Kip, because that's what I often do, or Tip. And then you can say, huh? Just like you didn't pretend that you understand the child. And in a lot of cases, the children try to do better. And that's an indication that the representation is better than that they produce, because they are aware of the fact that it didn't, they might not be aware of their own representation, but they are aware that the communication is hindered if they produce it the way they do. So they have to do better. And so some of the children don't. They give you the same back, and for them, they clearly don't notice their own mispronunciation. And the children that do, you can see whether this fits with the rest of the analysis. So we can maybe then look whether they also do differently in the perception study. So we have more measures of the same children to see what kind of patterns we find. It's a really challenging project. I don't know whether we're going to succeed, but I think this, if we do, this will be breakthrough, because it's really challenging to get so many. We do all studies at 2 labs to get enough power, but it requires a lot of training and clever thinking of all the experiments. And that's where we stand now. So I've learned from the production data a lot. I've learned from the perception data a lot, but I think we need to look at both the phonology. We have to take the phonology serious, and the psycholinguistic processes that matter. So I think we have to combine both in the same children. And because each of the methods that I've used so far gives you some of the results. It's interesting and it is valuable, but they all have their limitations. So I really like it if you use multiple methods and they show converging data, because then you can be reasonably sure that you're tapping into something seriously. There's very little research that has done both perception and production with the same children. Perfectly know why, because it's also really hard. It is an exciting young field to be in these days, acquisition, because there are so many new techniques appearing and there's so many labs popping up everywhere. So it is really exciting, and we can learn from each other a lot to find the best studies, to also be able to tap into individual differences. That's so far still hard. I also think that cross-linguistic data are important to see which parts are universal because our acoustic apparatus or our articulatory apparatus is made the way it is, and which parts are language specific. And I think we need more cross-linguistic studies, which are also still very rare. So I think that's where I think the future is heading. And yeah, maybe in 5 years I might be able to tell you some of the results. I don't know. It's going to be a big endeavor, and I'm a bit scared because it's so difficult, but we'll definitely get some results. And in the course of the years, many people have collaborated and have contributed to my work. So this is not my work alone, it is from many other people. Thank you for your attention.